afternoon, good evening, and afternoon, depending on where you are, who've joined us from all over the world. My name is Josh Truman. I'm the Vice President at Convergence.Tech, and today we have an amazing panel who will be discussing the future of learning from a global perspective. We'll cover some important questions with a few of our world's most innovative education leaders, and I truly hope that everyone who has committed their time to join us today walks away enlightened and excited about the future of education on all corners of our beautiful world. So here is the format for what our plan today. We're going to take a few moments for each panelist to briefly introduce themselves and tell a little bit more about their background in education. And then I'll kick off the conversation asking questions that draw out some of the high-level themes and trends we should all be thinking about. So without further ado, I'd like to kick off the introductions with Cami, and then we will just go right down the line from there. So Cami, if you don't mind, we'd love to have you introduce yourself.
Great, thank you, Josh. It's such an honor to be here with all these distinguished scholars and educators and activists. I am a former teacher, theater geek, athlete turned nonprofit executive. Worked at Teach for America, at New Leaders for New Schools, helping train teachers and principals, and then was the superintendent of alternative high schools in New York City, which we can talk about, serving 90,000 students that were 16 to 23 and had really been failed by the main system. And then I was superintendent of Newark Public Schools, which we can also talk about. And since leaving Newark, I run my own organization called ThirdWay Solutions, and we work with nonprofits, corporations, and school systems across the country on innovative and bold ideas related to equity in education. So that's me. Thrilled to be here.
Thanks, Cami. Baz.
Thanks, Josh. My name is Baz Nijjar. I'm currently based in Dubai, but my teacher training was in the UK. I spent 5 or 6 years there, then moved over to Dubai to work for GEMS Education, which is the largest provider of education for the K-12 age group. Currently, I am a principal advisor for education and technology ecosystems. I work alongside the schools, with the schools, but I also work outward facing in bringing partnerships and technologies to the group. And it's quite an interesting role because I get to work with the students, the staff, and the industry. And looking forward to hearing everyone else's personal experiences as well.
Thank you, Baz. Appreciate that. Ryan.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Ryan Persaud, and I'm currently at the International School of Curitiba in Brazil. My role here is the Director of IT and Innovation. This is my 4th year here. I had a brief stint last year through the pandemic as the head of school here as well, and currently this year I'm transitioning back into my role as Director of IT and Innovation. Before my time here in Brazil, I spent 4 years in South Korea at Korea International School in the classroom, as well as Assistant Director of Teaching and Learning. And prior to that, in Canada, that's where my teacher training is from, as well as my undergrad and my master's as well. Holding a variety of roles, working with at-risk youth, was a classroom teacher, also working as an instructional program leader. Just very excited to be here and for the conversation today.
Excellent. Thank you, Ryan. Anita.
Well, hello to everybody. My name is Anita Karwal, and presently I am heading the Ministry of School Education for the Government of India, as I'm designated as Secretary School Education for Government of India. I'm a civil servant. I've put in about 35 years in the civil service, and I have worked at various levels from grassroots onwards, delivering education as an educational administrator at school level, at state level, at sub-state level, at the national level. My experience is mostly in policy making and implementing policy at very large scale. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita. Sunju.
Hi, thanks for having me here. My name is Sunju Gong. Gong is my family name, so you can call me Soon. It's easier. I'm the Chief Skills Officer of SkillsFuture Singapore. SkillsFuture Singapore is a government agency under the Ministry of Education. Essentially, we are the skills authority. We anticipate skills, identify the skills, and then making sure that the education and training institutions is able to roll out programs, and then we provide cost fee subsidies and also SkillsFuture credits to citizens to make sure that they can reskill. So over the last 15 years, I'm privileged to be part of the whole Singapore's reskilling initiative within the agency. Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you, Soon. And that is a perfect segue into our first question. And actually, soon it's going to be a two-question question, if you will. And let's go ahead and get started. The question is, we spend the majority of our time focused on education at the K-12 and college level, but rarely talk about adult learning. How can we, as we move forward as nations, support adults as we reskill and upskill our workforce? And the second part is also, what does research say about how we learn at different phases of our lives?
Thanks, Josh. I think that's a very important question. I know a lot of us today here on the panel are part of the formative year education, which I call it gender education, and that is super important. But as we look at, a lot of research has suggested that people under the age of 20 in advanced economy has a high chance of living to 100 years. And even among here, a lot of us, I think the chance of living to 90 is possible. So with that longevity, we are asking ourselves then, how can we make sure that every one of us can have a fulfilling career at different stages of our life? So that the first 20 years, the front-end loading mode of education and learning is not enough. We have to allow individuals the opportunity to reskill themselves according to their career aspirations. And that is not an easy task, although it takes a lot of effort from the individual. I will call that we have to be a working learner. That means throughout our life, we are working, but we have to assume that identity of a learner all the time, because things are changing so rapidly, especially when business models are changing, business processes are changing because of digitalizations. Over the next 5 to 10 years, you'll see that digitalizations and green economy is going to change a lot of our job content. So we have to keep learning. So individual has to be a working learner. And that's not enough. I think an employer do have to play an important role in identifying the skills, develop the skills, and use the skills so that the workforce have the chance to learn, acquire, and then apply the skills, and for good career. And then, of course, we cannot do all this without the education and training institutions, because they are the ones who make sure that the content, the skill sets are applied throughout learning at institution-based and also at workplaces. So I'll say that to do reskilling continuously, we will need all hands on deck and making sure that the three stakeholders, individuals, employers, and education and training institutions really play a key role. And for government, I think our role is really to make sure that we can develop a robust and dynamic skill ecosystem so that all these key stakeholders can play their part. I come to answer your second questions. I think if today we compare the kind of research done in terms of the science of learning, huge mountains of research have been done for K-12 and below. But if you look at adult learning, I think it started to form a body of knowledge, but is comparatively is still small. And individuals, as we grow older, our reference of learning is always based on past of experience, and we actually make reference, and learning is very social. And I think we need to invest a lot more in terms of sciences of learning and learning sciences, and that involve different interdisciplinary learning, for example, like neuroscience, and how does the brain work? How can we reduce cognitive load? Because there's a lot of maybe some unpleasant experience that deter some people from furthering their learning. I think how do we remove that, and how do we strengthen, improve the motivations? And these are things that we still need to invest a lot more. So in Singapore, we invest sizable amount of research fund to really understand how to realize human potentials from cradle all the way to as long as we can live, so that we can have a fulfilling and active aging population. That's in the summary, I can answer Josh's question. Thanks.
Thank you, Sam. Much appreciated. Would anyone like to add to that? Cami?
Yeah, so when I was in New York City, I had adult education as part of my portfolio. So we had 60,000 learners that were older than 21, typically 21 to 25. So just 3 quick things that we learned there. One, from an equity standpoint in the US, we don't invest a lot. The amount of money available for that group of young people, even if they were failed by K-12, is quite small, right? And so then you have individuals that have to choose between working and reskilling, which is furthering the divide, right? And so we have some research that supports when you pay individuals a living wage to reskill, then it has a generational impact on poverty, but we don't do that. We make people choose. And so therefore, the ability to reskill and becomes a luxury and a privilege instead of a right or something that can break cycles of poverty. And then finally, in the United States, and I'm inspired by what's happening around the world, we think of career and technical education as being very narrow, very, very limiting, and often not rigorous, not high quality, and reserved for those individuals who can't make it in K-12, as opposed to being what we do know about adult education, which is that the more adults do things in context, the more likely they are to learn it. It's not this big, exciting thing that gives you an access to a wide array of jobs. It's the opposite. So I agree with everything that Soon said, and just want to say that from an equity standpoint in the United States, we're pretty much doing the opposite of a lot of that at scale. And I think there's a movement to change that, and it can't come fast enough.
That's very good points. Thank you, Cami. So the next question is for you, Anita, and it's a big one, knowing that you oversee 250 million students. The question is, how can we scale education for all students despite differences in language, socioeconomic status, diversity, et cetera? And how does this affect the curriculum that we deliver for our students?
Thank you, Josh. Yes, it's very challenging. Let me say it outright in the beginning. What we do in India, I'll tell you from my experiences, there is a huge amount of planning which goes at various levels. Let me talk about the National Education Policy, which was released last year in 2020. Now, this policy talks about changes in the curriculum, in the way we do assessment, in the way we teach, the pedagogies, the textbooks, the content, everything. There's a skilling. There is a huge amount of emphasis on skilling. Now, how does one deliver such an important national education policy? When we started the plan process last year, we invited the stakeholders through various technology platforms to give us their ideas and inputs how to implement the policy. You'll be surprised to know we got more than 1.5 million inputs and suggestions. We got them together, and then we prepared an implementation plan, let out the draft, and again called for a lot of inputs, a lot of discussions, deliberations. And finally, the plan was prepared in a record 1 year time. Then comes the implementation part. The plan is ready with a lot of suggestions and inputs. Sub-plans have to be made, goals, targets. Now we are in that process. So for example, we have recently launched in mission mode foundational literacy and numeracy for 3 to 9 year olds. The goals have been laid down, and we are in the process of actually ensuring that the goals go down to the last teacher, to the last parent, in fact, to the last student. And for that, a huge amount of community participation, dissemination, awareness, advocacy is required. So a school education department such as mine alone cannot do this. It requires the active participation of a number of stakeholders in the ecosystem. And it's not just the government, but it is also the people, it is the private players, it is organizations, institutions, higher education, skilling institutions. So the process right now that is going on is that we are trying to bring all of them together at various levels, not just at the national level, deliberations, discussions going on at state level, at school level, at cluster level. And a huge amount of teacher capacity building has been initiated since last year itself. Taking the advantage of the pandemic, for the first time, we could do this online teacher education. We started by minimum 50 hours of CPD, continuous professional development of teachers online. And we have managed to train 4.2 million teachers so far on standardized modules, which the center deliberated with the states and in regional languages. So 4.2 million are over. Now we are working on the next 5.6. The next level has also started. So, and these training modules are actually based on the requirements of the National Education Policy. More than 80 modules of 4 to 5 hours each, which are absolutely engaging, very activity oriented modules, which are followed by an assessment. They have been taken over. So when you want to go to scale, it is the teacher who is the linchpin of the system. And it is the teacher who's going to drive the system. And we believe that the teacher and the head of the school, these are the two areas if we focus the most on, then the delivery is much smoother than just pushing it from the top level or even, just doing discussions and deliberations. One more small example that I want to give you is that when we talk about languages in India, there are 22 languages which are given in the Constitution of India. There are more than 750 spoken languages by majority of the people of the country, and there are 1,600 other dialects which are spoken by several other people. So when we want to deliver education at the school level, and we want the child to become, to achieve foundational literacy, we have to deliver education in the language of the child. It was because of the pandemic which acted as such a huge disruptor that for the first time we could come out with content, e-content on a huge digital platform that we have, which is a federated structure in several languages, including the Indian Sign Language. And this content, we put it in QR codes in the textbooks of the children. So each textbook will have 40 to 50 QR codes in various parts of the book in hard spots, etc. So anytime, anywhere in your own language, you have content available for the first time. Or we get something like 60 million hits a day on this platform, which is a federated structure called Diksha. And so this is the other experience. So what has happened is that technology has become the driver right now for teacher education, for content, etc. Of course, it is a fact that all our children do not have access to devices, etc. We are working on that. In those areas, our teachers are personally going house to house with worksheets, having parent-teacher meetings, etc. And these are very closely monitored. So going to scale requires a lot of tools and applications and community participation and stakeholder participation.
Wow, Anita, I'm not gonna lie, I did get the chills as you were speaking. That it is quite an undertaking, and it's very impressive. So I really appreciate that. Thank you, Anita. Would anyone care to join and add to that? Or I feel like Anita kind of nailed it there. All right. The next question we're going to direct towards Ryan, and we're going to have the follow-up answer by Cami. And that question is, how has COVID shined a light on the socioeconomic divide? And how can we make quality education a reality for students of all socioeconomic backgrounds? Ryan?
Yeah, thank you. I'd just like to start with a couple of statistics, and these are pre-COVID 2018, and then I'm gonna mention something that during COVID. But from the OECD here in Brazil, 11% of upper secondary enrolled in vocational programs. OECD average 42%. 25 to 34-year-olds with post-secondary degrees, 21%, compared with 45% OECD average. Enrollment rate of 15 to 19-year-olds in education ranked 37 out of 40 countries from the OECD. These are all pre-COVID. Then the United Nations from November 2020, so this is during the pandemic here in Brazil, 5 million children, 6 to 17 with no access to school. So we've really been in an unfortunate situation here where there already was a divide when it came to education. There already was we know there was a huge socioeconomic strata when it came to just access and then who was actually graduating and moving on to post-secondary. We know that there are publicly funded universities here, but unfortunately, you're looking at one spot and, you know, an average of 200 plus competing for that one spot. And if you don't get in, then you have to go to a private. Well, if I can't afford to go, how can I afford to go and access this private post-secondary education? So that's kind of the context that we're dealing with, and has only worsened, unfortunately, as we've moved through the pandemic. Now, some of my thoughts around how we can have improvement in this area. One, I mentioned this when we had our call previously, that I do have the privilege of working for an international private school, which comes with serving a different type of population than accesses public school. You know, I worked in public schools for 10 years back home, as I mentioned, and so I understand the stark difference there. I think there's creating an atmosphere where international private schools like myself have an obligation to partner with public schools in the various countries that they operate in. I see this as a real tremendous opportunity. We've taken strides here in terms of bringing people over for conferences from public schools, working with them and making donations in terms of time and equipment that we have access to. But I think these partnerships can go even further, and have to, if there's going to be a way that we're going to be able to lift these students out of poverty and get them access to education. We know that Wi-Fi has proven an issue in various parts of the country through the pandemic. So really setting up those types of structures, and of course, access to hardware as well. We know that's been an issue. So I think one of the other things that can be done is in terms of allocating resources strategically, thinking about those who are traditionally marginalized, those who exist in rural areas here in Brazil. And so how can the Department of Education and our politicians think about that in terms of allocating resources? So those are some of my thoughts.
Oh, I appreciate it, Ryan. Thank you very much. And I hate to say it, but some of those stats are scary. And I hope that the disruption of COVID really points us in the right direction. Cami, your thoughts?
Well, I mean, how much time do you have? This is a whole, right? This is like a 2-hour deal. But just to pile on some shock and awe from the United States, in California, 75% of Black boys are not meeting grade level standards right now. Black students are 4 times more likely to be suspended or kicked out of school than their white peers. And students who identify as LGBTQIA, it's about 3.5 times. Students with disabilities, about 3 times. In Los Angeles Unified, where I did a project on special education, 10% of students that had been identified as having special needs were reading at grade level. During the pandemic, LAUSD reported they lost about 40% of high school students, like literally didn't hear from them. So again, just to sort of confirm here in the United States, right, the gaps when it comes to race, poverty, students who identify as LGBTQIA, students with disabilities, and their peers were already huge. And you know, we see them getting even wider during the pandemic. I was the superintendent of Newark when Hurricane Sandy hit. And so the only sort of window I have into this current moment is that our power was wiped out for almost a month in Newark, which is a very poor city. And I realized that my budget was 4 times the size of the mayor's. And so when it came to clearing trees, pushing out information through phone calls, health and wellness checks, meals, warming centers, right? So one thing we're seeing the pandemic interfacing with Con Edison, you know, phasing the power coming back on, like that was us, our team, because we had the infrastructure. And we're seeing that in the United States around COVID, like schools are feeding people and school systems are passing out devices and infrastructure. And I have 2 thoughts about that. One, that's ridiculous. Like, where's our safety net, right? And 2, if that's how it's going to be, then we need to resource it properly. Everybody was, losing their minds about the recent federal funding. And by the time you pay for wipes and ventilation and retrofitting buildings that didn't even have air conditioner in places where it's 100 degrees in the summer, that money is spent, right? So the ARP money was truly just base level, acknowledging what we've always known, that in too many communities like Newark and around the country, the school system is the safety net, right? So we need to fix that. And while we're fixing that, we need to invest knowing that's the case. And even here, right, that just got us to maybe the baseline of Maslow's needs, let alone the real innovation that needs to occur around education. And then, with my other hat, I think, gosh, we shouldn't unlearn any of these lessons. We shouldn't unlearn what we learned about technology, which is that we're totally underutilizing it. Technology has revolutionized everything that we do in our lives, except K-12 classrooms in the US look like they did in 1952. Like, we shouldn't unlearn that. We shouldn't unlearn this lesson. School systems can change on a dime. They just did. We have all these conversations, go slow to go fast, and systems can't change. Well, guess what, right? We shouldn't unlearn the lesson that families are the right hand to our left hand. Like, we are in families' homes for once. We actually know them. We rise and fall with their support and their partnership. But in the US, we treat them like they're an afterthought in K-12 education. We shouldn't unlearn the fact that we're not going to win without a real partnership, and we should expand our definition of families. And finally, we should really think out of the box about models. Some kids, I hate to say it, some kids have gotten much further behind during this time. Some kids are thriving. You know why? Because school stunk for them before the pandemic. They weren't seen, they weren't heard, they weren't affirmed, they didn't see themselves in the textbooks. Teachers didn't understand them. They were victims of implicit biases and cultures that weren't making them thrive. And so let's lean into that learning. Let's be courageous and figure out how we can think about new models and new ways, and not try to create just a one size fits all, because it wasn't working to begin with. So never let a good crisis go to waste. Obviously, there's been tremendous human tragedy. No one would ever want this to happen. But at the same time, the sort of longing to go back to business as usual, I don't get it. I think we should be doing the opposite.
Can I just say that?
Sure, please.
Josh, that I so agree. I'm going to talk more in a moment, but I so agree with Cami, if I pronounced her name correctly. We have to use COVID as the opportunity completely to rethink and reconceptualize education. And the block is often those who are invested in the status quo in schooling as it is.
Thank you. And Sir Anthony Seldon, could you take a moment and quickly introduce yourself for the group?
Of course, Josh. So first of all, apologies. I'm in rural France, and we had a massive cloudburst that's knocked the whole community. So I have run schools for 20 years. I ran two of Britain's leading schools, Brighton College and Wellington College, and for 5 years I ran Britain's top private university and medical school, and that gives me an unusual perspective. Particular interests are around AI, and the book I wrote called The Fourth Education Revolution, and how AI is on the verge of transforming not just the way that we do education, but the jobs that we're preparing young people for. And also because of all the change that's now coming into schools, I initiated at The Times. The Times is, as I'm sure everyone knows, one of Britain's leading national newspapers, an education commission. And interestingly and unusually, it's the first time Britain has ever had a commission viewing education as a whole, from early years to adult education and lifelong education, because we separate it all, whereas in fact there are so many factors that apply to all of it. Probably that's enough, Josh, for me at the moment.
Thank you, Sir Anthony, and welcome. With an eye on the clock, I'd love to move to the next question, which is for Boz. And the question is, what role do employers play in the development of school curriculum, or what role do you believe they should play?
Yeah, thank you, Josh. It's great hearing everyone's answers as well. It's a lot of takeaways I think we have from today, and I'd love to continue these conversations as well, based on especially the network that we run, across the world. In terms of this particular question, industry has a key role, right, in future employment, in where our students end up going to, and often they miss out the K-12 education, mainly because I guess they can't penetrate the different national curriculums, and there's a lot of battles that they have to have with governance and regulators. But in the past few years, they've started to take that into their own hands and started providing, their own curriculum opportunities that students can undertake in their own time. So rather than, working with and alongside the regulators, because I guess they've had the challenges over the years and they haven't succeeded, they've started to develop their own curriculum content. And we're big believers of that. We've got a few schools that actually took the matters into their own hands and decided to offer some of these industry qualifications during their school curriculum time alongside their academic provision. Because at the moment, when you leave the K-12 education, you've got a certain set of skills, but those skills aren't necessarily catered to the job requirements or the careers that you want to get into. And I guess this fits into a lot of the points that have been mentioned today about lifelong learning and continuous learning. And we all have to be adaptable. We all have to leave and be able to reskill ourselves, because in the next 20 years, we don't know what the jobs will look like. We can pretend to predict them, but we don't know actually what they will entail. Now, we need to bring that down into formal education as well. And that's where the regulators need to start working with governments and industry. And the role of the industry is, at the end of the day, they hold the cards in where our careers will end up. They're the ones that develop the skills, the qualifications, the jobs that we are going into. Now, if we have to wait until we leave university education, spend all of that money, and then reskill ourselves again to get into the jobs we want to do, then what has been the point of having the K-12 education in the first place? So what we've tried to do is a couple of our schools have modeled the academic, so that you feature and you achieve your goals in terms of your exam results, to get the certifications. Then you also take some of these industry qualifications with the likes of IBM, Microsoft, Amazon, and so forth. And now it's starting to filter down even at younger ages. So before it was maybe 16 to 18 year olds, we're looking at 14 to 18, and then 11 to 18, and then even younger now, younger age groups are getting involved in some form of industry education. And that is the way forward. Their role is as important as anyone else in developing the future leaders. So in fact, it's not just on them, it should be on all of us to sit together and work and form one institute that will develop the learners, their personal skills, as well as these career focused skills and the future skills that we'll require. And the fourth industrial revolution, if you look at the past revolutions, and I think Cami and Soon had mentioned this as well, education has been the same in most of the formats, whereas these revolutions have happened, they've come and gone, but the way we teach, even with the technology revolution, didn't necessarily innovate the actual curriculum. It was more a case of we did it a slightly different way. And that's why industry took it into their own hands and started offering these online courses, these digital courses, so that people and students can take them at their own pace. They then end up developing the type of employees they need and not rely on education itself. So they have a key factor to play. And there's a lot of scope for this to continue developing. And there are new schools being formed as a result, where they've took it into their own hands and they are redeveloping the education system. I know there's a lot in America, for example, where you may have a little bit more freedom depending on your state. But for me, as a global, unity, we should be a collective. We should have the governance, the industry, the regulators, the education institutions working together, so that these pathways are created, so we wouldn't need as much reskilling when we've left, the K-12 education.
Thank you, Boz. And I'm just going to repeat the question for Sir Anthony. The question is, what role do employers play in the development of school curriculum, or what role do you believe they should play?
I agree with a lot of what Baz, everything that Baz actually said there. So there are two questions. What role do they play? Well, of course, it differs between different countries and different jurisdictions, but essentially not very much, because across the world, school curriculums which have become homogenized, partly through splendid organizations like the International Baccalaureate Organization and PISA, and Andrea Schleicher of PISA is the international advisor on the Times Education Commission, which I mentioned. I mean, there's an homogenization going on, but employers are not welcome in many places in the world. They're often, particularly true in Britain, dissatisfied with the products of schools. They do not need people to sit in rows at the end of a long academic year and sit exams purely on their own, often involving memorizing skills. They don't need that. They need people who are engaged, personable, who can present themselves. We all know there's people who are problem solvers. They need entrepreneurial thinkers. So what role do they play? It depends on the country, but in general, very little. And what role should they play? Much more. But we should remember that education is about, in part, providing a job and the skills that you need to work, but it is also about preparing you for life. And it's about much more than just the skills for work. So it's not doing a good job in the UK, at least in preparing people for work. It's not doing a good job in preparing people for higher and further education. And it's not doing a good enough job in preparing people for society, which is why mental unwellness, another particular interest of my own, is rising and rising. So it's extraordinary that the world over, many of the most brilliant minds in all the countries represented today, and in many other countries, many of the most brilliant minds are excluded, including minds in industry, are excluded from the school curriculum. There are self-governing, very protective status quo hierarchies who decide what it is appropriate for the young people to learn. And it is simply, this is my core point, it was out of date in the last century. Fundamentally, we have an education model that has not changed since the beginning of industrialization. And now the technology, the understanding, as we heard, of brain science, the understanding of child development has moved on so quickly. And yet we continue to see ethnic minority children being failed by the school system. In the UK, social divisions have grown, which were growing already before COVID, have grown massively during COVID. Many young people feel alienated from the school menu that's slapped down in front of them. We should begin less with what they already have than thinking, you know, what might engage young people of color, of different backgrounds, and because they are decent, fundamentally interesting, humane people with an equal right to be stimulated by schools. But rather than switching them on, school too often, the world over, switches them off. And now the technology, to finish where I began, the AI technology in the fourth education revolution offers the chance for an outstanding quality of education for every child, so they can be as engaged in their learning as they are playing computer games, if they have access to the technology at home in the evening. The learning, the whole way that we think about schools is changing.
I think we may have lost Sir Anthony. I hate to cut him off, but I do want to move forward with the final question for Cami. And thank you, Boz and Sir Anthony, for those answers. Very helpful and very excellent. The last question: what have we learned about social emotional learning and equity within our education systems as a result of COVID-19? And how do we move forward now that some shortfalls, many shortfalls maybe, have been exposed in our education system? Cami?
Sure. So when I just sort of step back from all the weeds and I think about awesome schools that are delivering for all kids, like where all kids are thriving, they kind of do four things well. One is they have the right people, the right mindset, the right skill set. Right. Two, they have the right content that's engaging, it's rigorous. And I just want to make sure we don't lose the idea of rigor when we talk about skill training and, workforce training, because that's just not what it's meant here. And we don't ask wealthy white kids to choose what they want to be when they're 16. We don't. We teach them how to be awesome and then give them a million choices. I think we need to do the same thing for kids of color. So two, they have great content. It's engaging, it's smart, it's thoughtful, it's just in time, it's rigorous, it's all the things. Three, they have great operations. The trains run on time. They have access to technology. The facilities are high quality and reflect the values, right? And then four, everything else, right? And that everything else has to do with trust and culture and climate, and including but not limited to how schools think about struggle and difference and conflict and incidents, right? So that we call it the fourth leg of the stool, which is to say you can't have a great school that doesn't have the right people, the right content, awesome operations for sure. But I think the thing that we talk about the least is that fourth leg, which is how do you build purposeful, high-performing, motivating cultures where kids feel seen, they feel psychologically and emotionally safe, where they literally feel seen in what they see in the content and also seen in terms of who they show up, how they show up in the space. So that fourth leg of the stool to me is the most underdeveloped, preachy, finger waggy, misunderstood, under discussed. Even as a member of the school reform and innovation community, whenever I talked about the fourth leg of the school 15 years ago, everybody was like, oh gosh, Cami, you've gone soft. Like, what's wrong with you? But I actually think that learning science would support that there's an inextricable link between psychological and emotional safety and the ability to intake information, number one. Number two, feeling affirmed and developing trusting relationships is the single most research-based anecdote we have to trauma. And we all just are experiencing right now collective trauma, profoundly so. And the only thing we know is that secure, attached, trusting relationships is the way forward for folks who are experiencing trauma. And then finally, just expectations. There's reams of research that show we don't actually really expect that Black and brown kids can do math at high levels. And unfortunately, a lot of instincts are, well, if they can't learn that, we'll put them in this other thing that's going to excite them. And it's like, well, maybe we should just teach it better. and maybe we should actually examine our own biases and why young people of color experience very subtle and very overt messages that their academic aptitude is less than, right? Even young people who score at or above their same white peers in high school have about half the access to AP classes, to IB classes, right? So the systemic biases are baked in. So that fourth leg of the stool to me, which is about expectations, culture, climate, incident, struggle, how we think about mistakes. SEL is as much about taking risks and falling on your face. And when that happens for wealthy white students, we applaud them. And when it happens for kids of color and poor kids, we control it, we punish it. We give them less of the thing they need, which is more time on task. So I hope we make deeper investments and get a lot more serious and rigorous and pointed and thoughtful and dogged about figuring out that fourth leg of the stool. In my estimation, it's the thing that's lagged the most in innovation in the US. And I think it is the root cause of why we have such gaps in how students achieve. Yes, we can fix curriculum. Yes, we should have the best people in front of folks. Yes, we should have the right amount of resources. Yes to all that. And if we're not serious about examining what's wrong with that fourth leg, I don't think any of that's going to be adequate.
Thank you, Cami. And that was a great way to wrap for the day. And I think I personally, Ryan, Boz, Cami, Anita, Soon, I personally thank you for taking the time. I know we're all over the world, different time zones. It means a ton to us. And also thank you from Convergence.Tech. And I hope everyone that joined us today found value in our conversation. And with that, I good night to Soon and others. I hope you have a great day. And thank you again for joining us, and really excited for the conversations. Thank you.